I just yelled at the TV and I'm like, how can he hurt that little girl? How can he lie to her? She thinks he loves her, all like a dad. It was just like, oh my gosh, to actually see it and to actually realize what that person did to me, to my parents, to my sisters, to my family and friends. It was just so overwhelming.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. Or if this is your first time joining in, thank you for being with us. This podcast is a safe space for victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault to share their stories and connect with others who've been through similar experiences. I believe that sharing our stories is the first step to healing, and my hope is that the SAS podcast will help victims and survivors feel less alone and more empowered. I'm your host, Dave Markel, coming to you from the Pod Vlog studio in St. George, Utah, and I'm here each week to provide a platform for victims and survivors to tell their story and for experts and professionals to offer insights and information to help us all on our healing path and to provide an education on being trauma-informed in order to help bring justice to victims and survivors of rape or sexual assault. If you are a victim, survivor, or know someone who is, or if you investigate or prosecute rape or sexual assault cases, or if you provide treatment, counseling, or interact with victims or survivors of rape or sexual assault in any capacity, I urge you to listen to this podcast. Remember, you are not alone, and we are all here to support you. Hey everybody, I am so fortunate to have in the studio with me, as promised many months ago, Jan Broberg is in studio. How are you, Jan?
I'm so good, Dave. Thanks for having me again. I feel honored.
I'm the honored one, mainly because not only are you one of my best friends, and it's an honor to know you for that reason, but also because since our last episode together, which actually I think was recorded for your podcast, not mine, but you allowed me to use it and air it on my show.
Well, why not?
It has been the number one listened to episode since I started back in November of last year.
That's incredible.
So I am just
really something.
Thrilled that you are part of this show and that you've agreed to come back. I kind of wanted to do a check-in with you. Lots has happened since that episode aired.
Yes,
and many of my listeners, of course, have listened to that episode and watched your life story unfold on Peacock TV with a friend of the family.
Yeah.
Know your story. So we're not going to go through all of that. I wanted to kind of check in with you about the impact that made, because I happen to know, because we're friends and we stay in touch and we talk a lot.
Yeah.
That left a really impactful impression on you and had an effect.
It did. And you know what's so interesting is I've been telling my story in a lot of different ways, by first writing it in an English class in college and then calling my parents and, why didn't you know, how could I have lost these years, and having big conversations with them. And all along the way, as I began to tell the story really in earnest, I had a friend who had invited me to share my story. This is way before there were any books or documentaries or a series. And she had a little book club. And I'm like, well, I don't have a book. Who's going to want to hear about my story? She goes, no, just telling people about your story. I think that it'll be really informational and educational. And most of the women in her book club were all entertainers at Disney World like I was. Mm-hmm. And she was. It's a funny thing because I look back and I'm like, so here's a group of women, but we're all young. We're in our 20s, and most of us don't have children. I had just had my son, Austin, so I remember carrying him in the little baby carrier, and I was taking a leave of absence, from Disney. They were great company. They paid for everything. I loved it. And that I could still stay home and do the nesting and have some time. And walking into that living room, and just opening up and sharing my story and not having any pathway of how to share it. And the questions that they asked were so interesting that I thought, oh, well, maybe there is something here that when you tell your story and they don't understand certain things, or I don't even understand certain things. It got me to, start doing some studying about what kind of brainwashing was that, or what, I mean, I didn't even have all the words like, oh, this is grooming, and oh, this is inculcation, and oh, this is such and such. I know things now that I didn't know then, but just to tell your story and to have people respond and ask questions was enlightening. So I've been doing that since that time. So my son is 34 years old. So I've been doing it on and off, not on purpose, not for pay, just because I thought maybe I had something that could help somebody. And so having now spoken at various conferences, again, that I was asked to speak at because I had a friend or whatever, I've written about it. I've written a book kind of with my mom. She interviewed me for that first book. And now we're working on the second book that has more details and has some pretty hefty forward and afterward on grooming and various things. I didn't know that I would be so struck by seeing it visually portrayed in a 9-part series where you have fantastic actors who embodied the real people, reminded me of myself, my parents, my sisters, my friends, my community, my congregation, that entering the world would be such a different experience because I'd never done that before. Right. A documentary was one thing. Writing a book was one thing. They all were telling my story. Everything that I had worked on with the production, from being invited to come into the writer's room and make a suggestion or have them ask me questions so they could get it right, or changing a little thing here and there. I knew what the scripts were about. I had read along the way all of them.
You were a producer. You knew the story and were watching it as it was being filmed, but not in its totality after the production came out. So that's what you're saying was so different? It
was, because when you're sitting there watching your story unfold and you feel like you're there, because the brick home that they found, and they cut a huge picture window in a brick home in Smyrna, Georgia, to make it look like my home in Pocatello, Idaho. I mean, it looked like my house. And it was just one of those experiences where you're completely engrossed in the story, your story, but to be experiencing it again in a very palpable, visceral way, which is what the medium of film and television, that's why it's so powerful, was a real, it was emotional. When I got through episode 5, and, there had been several times in some of the other episodes where I'm just, screaming at the TV. I was watching it with a group of friends, including you, the first couple of episodes.
Correct.
And I was just like, that son of a bitch. I don't know if you can say these things on your podcast or not.
Yeah.
But I just yelled at the TV, and I'm like, how can he hurt that little girl? How can he lie to her? She thinks he loves her, all like a dad. It was just like, oh my gosh, to actually see it and to actually realize what that person did to me, to my parents, to my sisters, to my family and friends. It was just so overwhelming that by the time I finished episode 5, and there's still 4 left, right? There were 9 episodes. I went home after watching it at our friend's house together with a group, family and my closest friends, like all of you, that were there. There's about, 8 to 10 of us at any given episode. And I got home and I went to bed, and I don't know if it was something specific, but I don't remember. I woke up the next morning and I felt like somebody had taken a baseball bat and just like beaten me all over my body. I was so stiff and sore, like I was a punching bag or something. And I woke up and I was like, oh my gosh, I can barely get myself out of this bed. My muscles hurt. My head was exploding. I just felt like, wow, something like a Mack truck hit me, that kind of feeling physically. And so I got out of bed and I'm still in my pajamas. And I'm like, oh, I got to go downstairs and maybe take some ibuprofen or aspirin, or man, I got body aches everywhere. And not putting really 2 and 2 together until I saw my mom. And then I just started bawling. And I went over to her and I'm like, Mom, how did you do it? How did you survive? I'm so angry. How did you not know where your child was? How did you get through the torment and the torture? And I was just like, I was so angry for everyone that was hurt, including myself in my life. And I just started crying. And I was, like I said, physically felt like I'd been beat up. And for about 8 days, I just cried. And I just kept hugging my mom and thanking her for hanging in there as my mother, and for writing the book, for keeping all of the evidence, basically. She held on to everything, every letter, every note, every little diary that me and Karen both have, a diary that talks about our relationship with the Birchtolds, or specifically for Karen was, Jimmy, and for me it was Jerry. And you have all of that stuff. And now we're getting all the evidence that was found in Discovery for the documentary and for the series that they were using. And now all of a sudden, we also have court records of the hearings. We have, people that have done, what do you call those things, Dave, when you go in and you make a report? They ask you to talk and they write down your statement. It's called
a sworn statement.
Yeah, something like that. We have some of those sorts of things. And I didn't have any of that information when we were writing our books. It was the information from our memories, of course, and also from the things that we had, personal things, but not court recordings and proceedings and documents that were discovered when the Abducted in Plain Sight documentary came out, and then even more Discovery from the series, and they worked together with all that material. And after those 8 days, I was ready to watch the last 4 episodes. And of course, they didn't all come out at once. They came out one at a time. So over the next few weeks, we watched the rest of them, and we got to the end. And I think by the end of the series, the one thing that I wanted to have happened, I knew had happened. I wanted people, for the last 34 years of telling my story, what I realized is that I wanted people to understand what grooming is and how subtle it is and how it doesn't look scary. It doesn't look like a stranger. It looks like someone you know, someone you trust, someone that maybe you even love. And that is all the manipulation that is going to allow them to do things that nobody else is going to see. They're going to do it in secret. There's going to be threats and rewards. And it's the most confusing thing for anyone who is groomed within that orbit, because they look back and go, why didn't I see it? Why didn't I know? How could I have let that monster in my front door? Because they don't look like that. And that happened in the series. I felt like it really told the psychological manipulation of a true master manipulator, predator, criminal, psychopath. And that's what people need to know, because to any degree where abuse is, or violence against children, young people, tweens, teens, is happening in secret, it's so subtle that even the victim, even a teenager, has no idea what's happening to them. They're not even sure until much, much later, most of the time, was that okay, what that older person did to me? Is it my fault? Those are the questions they're asking themselves. And you almost have to teach the whole world that if you were groomed to do certain things, it's not your fault, so that then you can begin to heal. And that's what happened towards the end of the series. That was into November. Before Thanksgiving, it was complete, and I'd seen it all before we had Thanksgiving. And I was like, hallelujah, that one message that was so important to me, that I felt like I still had not been able to tell that story. All the shocking twists and turns were in the documentary, which made it such a compelling story. But the grooming, the subtle, the long, sophisticated burn of a predator, that's what I want people to see, because they're not suspecting that it's somebody they know that's close to them, for themselves or their children.
I am so glad to hear you say what you're saying, because it resonates. I know it resonates with so many of the listeners of this show. And I think they need to hear that what they're feeling, what they're experiencing now, they can say, I'm not alone. And Jan's story is striking a chord with so many victims and survivors out there that listen to this podcast and your podcast. And I know you've gotten feedback. Your online community and emails and things along those lines that are coming to you from your listeners also.
Yeah, it's really been very rewarding. I didn't even know what an online community was a few years ago. And then my son started talking about it, and he goes, Mom, what you want to do, what you're talking about is starting a foundation, but to get personal with people, like you keep saying, it's one person at a time. How will we ever affect the whole world? He goes, you need an online community. I said, huh? What's that?
Right.
And it took him a long time to actually help me wrap my head around why that would be such a powerful way to go, because, you know, during COVID, everything went kind of online. And that's really what it is. It's like being in a room with other survivors who really just need a safe place to be believed, to not be judged, to not be blamed, but to be believed is like the biggest step in your healing. And if you don't have that in your immediate circle, maybe even brothers, sisters, parents, close friends, they often pull away when you try to tell them what happened to you, because either they can't handle it for themselves to know, or they just are like, well, that's in the past, let's move on, you know, kind of a thing. They don't really know what to do. It's why somebody like you, Dave, that goes and trains people. How do you talk to someone who's experienced severe trauma? Well, you don't talk. You listen with empathy. That's the first thing you taught me. And that is the key. And so that's what our online community is really all about. It's about being in a safe place. You're not allowed to bring anything that would be dangerous or would be anything, except we are here to support each other. It's a peer-to-peer support group, basically online. And we bring in you and other professionals to share certain things so that we get to learn things and then make choices about, where do I need some healing? What can I do? And we can give each other, you know, just peer-to-peer advice. We're not professionals, but we do bring in some professionals, some therapists and people like you.
Right. And I think what's awesome about all of this, and I tell people this all the time, I'm not a therapist, but talking to someone with a trauma-informed approach and having an online community, even though there isn't a therapist there all the time. I know you've had therapists as guests, but that aspect of that peer-to-peer, people taking care of each other and building each other and supporting each other up, it actually provides a therapeutic atmosphere and result, even though it's not therapy per se. It's not clinical therapy, but it is therapeutic. And I think that's what's critical. That's why it's so helpful, and why I love what you're doing and what I get to do with my podcast. And I hear from my listeners the same kind of impact is being made, that they feel listened to.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of what you're talking about, what you said about the series finalizing and you realizing you got to feel the impact of what it was to get that message out of what manipulation is and what brainwashing is, what grooming is all about. And feeling that culmination and that finality of saying, yes, finally it's been told right, was therapeutic.
Very much so. Yeah. And I didn't even realize I still needed therapy, but I do.
Right.
I mean, and I think that's important too, that the healing process is a continual journey. It doesn't necessarily have an end,
right.
But what it does have are these milestones that you really do feel like you can look back and go, oh man, I've come a long way because I did enough repetitions, with that 10-pound weight or that 100-pound weight of abuse, and how to reprogram or repattern those neural pathways in my brain. I did it enough times in enough different ways that I actually have seen a shift in my life. It is possible.
That's exactly what happens. Yeah. Where the cognitive part of your brain, where what happened, is actually communicating with the limbic part of your brain, the limbic system, which is your emotional, right?
Yeah.
So you've got that executive functioning of figuring things out that's now talking to the emotional aspect of it, building those new pathways and communicating with your emotions in a different way so that you do feel that healing and you do feel different and feel like you've accomplished something.
And part of that, Dave, isn't it true that in order for those two things to start talking to each other in a different way, like your executive function talking to your emotional limbic function or whatever, not that I'm the neuroscientist because I'm not, but those two things actually talking and communicating with each other in a new way, if you do that enough times, that actually, if you could actually look at your brain, you would actually see a different pathway.
Correct.
And that is just like doing reps at the gym.
Yeah.
If you want a six-pack, you got to do, I don't know how many, 5,000, 500,000 sit-ups. I don't know what the number is, but it's the repetition of doing those things. And that is hard to do alone. That's why a community is so important. Or listening to other people's stories like they do on SAS, or they do it, on my podcast or whatever, wherever they're listening to stories of others and they hear about the healing being possible and they start to talk to their own brain without even maybe realizing it, but going, oh, this is an emotional response that I had. I don't have to have that same thing that always is stopping me or whatever. You can find ways to repattern those things if you do the repetition of it enough times. I think a lot of people think that, oh, now that I know something, it means I've accomplished it. Right. I'm like, well, I can know how to lose 10 pounds. I can know. But if I don't actually lift the weight, eat the right food, whatever, it's not going to happen. You can know tons of stuff.
That's absolutely right. You have to do the work.
Yeah.
And part of that is just like you just said, telling your story, talking about it. Hey, SAS listeners, we're very fortunate to have with us in the studio today Sierra Lancaster. Sierra is a representative of our sponsor, Unique Makeup and Beauty Products. Welcome, Sierra. I'm glad you're here.
Hi, happy to be here.
Tell us a little bit about Unique.
Unique is an awesome company. Our mission is to uplift, empower, and validate women. We have everything from makeup, skincare, collagen, basically any beauty item you're going to want.
Awesome. And how long have you been involved with Unique?
I started with Unique in September of 2019. I had a friend who was involved. She was a presenter, and I just watched her transformation and how confident she became, and I loved it, and I wanted to be able to do that for myself and to help other women with that.
I love hearing that. And the reason I chose Unique as our sponsor is because there's a tie between what SAS, Sex Assault Survivor Stories podcast, is doing and what Unique is doing. Tell us a little bit about that connection and why Unique and SAS go together.
Yeah, so SAPREA is the foundation that goes along with Unique. SAPREA exists to liberate individuals and society from child sexual abuse and its lasting impacts. 1 in 5 children in the United States are sexually abused before the age of 18, which needs to stop. And so SAPREA is there to help prevent that and also to offer hope and healing for those who have experienced it.
And what does SAPREA offer to your clients?
SAPREA has a retreat. It's called the SAPREA Retreat. This is a 4-day retreat that survivors can go to get the help that they need to continue their healing process. And then afterwards, they are given resources like therapists and phone calls and support groups that help them to continue with their healing.
So if our listeners want to know more about that, can they get a hold of you?
Yeah, they can reach me or they can go to sapria.org and we can include my contact in the show notes. They can reach out to me and it is a free retreat for survivors. It's all provided through donations. And so there's donations that you can, of course, make just monetary donations, or any purchase from my website gets 10% of the profits are donated directly to the Sapria Foundation.
That's great. One of the things that I think I'm really impressed with, you mentioned earlier the idea of how unique has helped your confidence. And that leads me to asking you about your confidence growth and the fact that you've just started a podcast yourself.
Yes, I have. So it's called Confidently Beautiful with Sierra. And the purpose of that podcast is just to show everyone that they already have the confidence inside them and we just need to bring it out.
I love that. Thank you again for being here.
Yep, of course.
We'll have you back sometime.
Sounds good.
Talking about it actually is part of the first steps to healing, which is why your online community is so powerful, because you're giving a platform, as SAS does. What we're doing right here is giving a platform to not only victims and survivors who are ready to talk, but to victims and survivors who are listening and evaluating and processing and applying what they're hearing from you and other guests who've been through similar circumstances and experiences.
Yeah.
It really does start things changing.
Kind of like that first domino, and then it pushes all the
keeps-
other ones
yes.
if you keep going.
Yeah, that's true. What is striking to me, if I could go back just for a minute to that experience that you had after the 5th episode and waking up the next morning and feeling like you'd been beat up, it really does talk to the concept that the body keeps the score, that our emotional responses are manifested and expressed physically.
Right.
So we feel it in our muscles, and everybody feels it in different ways. I've had guests talk about stomach aches and headaches and muscle aches, but the somatic response of the body from the psychological input can manifest anywhere in the body. And I'm glad you brought that up, because I think it really helps people who don't know what's going on. Why am I feeling this way? Why do I keep having these physical responses to my emotional reaction to whatever has activated a memory?
Right.
And it could have been like for you years and years ago, yet I could hear it in your voice just 10 minutes ago. It's just below the surface.
Mm-hmm.
All those emotions come back out, and you can actually break out into a sweat on your forehead, and your hands get sweaty and palmy and clammy, and your chin trembles, and feel the tears well up. All that pain is a physical manifestation of those severely traumatic emotional responses.
Yeah,
So,
that makes sense to me. I mean, because I can't even say that I was having any sort of a specific memory.
right.
It was more about my whole entire body was involved. And when I look back, I'm like, well, of course it was. You were missing. You had nothing but that life, that altered state. And that was attention for a little girl that had never been away from her family to wake up and be completely incarcerated, strapped down, incarcerated, funny voice coming out of that speaker box, and the whole world altered, and who I was completely altered.
Yeah.
And so why wouldn't my whole body feel that way? Because
Exactly.
it was a whole body experience. And anybody that's been through any sort of sexual violence, that's the thing that we don't talk about enough, that there are not only outcomes that continue to move you in all the wrong directions after assault, abuse, sexual violence, whether you're, a little kid or a tween or a teenager or even a young adult, but to adults that experience, sexual violence is a full body, brain, emotional shift. It affects every part of you.
It does. And even after therapy, even after understanding what's going on, those responses, once we are activated with a memory, I don't like to call them triggers necessarily, but that's for those of you who are wondering why I use that word activated. It's synonymous with the triggering that goes on. that's all autonomic. That's what's going on in the brain. And we don't have any control over what our amygdala and our hippocampus and hypothalamus and all of those interrelated limbic system brain parts do with those memories. It does. It takes us right back and manifests and expresses physically. And sometimes we don't even understand why or where those feelings are coming from.
Right.
Even if we have a complete understanding of our past histories, and these memories have been kind of put together in a continuum, that doesn't mean that our brains have completely resolved how to deal with those activators when they come up, and we will still experience some of the same emotional and physical manifestations of those traumas.
Yeah.
So it's great that you brought that up. I think it helps explain to a lot of people who are suffering through some of this stuff, who don't know what's going on.
And also, as you were saying that, I was like, so many people ask me, well, how did you heal? How long did it take? And I'm like, it took as long as it took. But the important part is you keep doing the repetitions until you build the muscle. And for different types of people and different ways that something might have affected you, it may not look exactly the same for every person. But definitely to be in a place where you are looking at what happened to you, like the Bruce Perry, Oprah Winfrey book, What Happened to You, not what's wrong with you.
Right.
Reframing how you look at yourself and others, because oftentimes all of the other things that somebody might be, self-harming themselves by, with various substances or food or the lack thereof or cutting or even multiple relationships and promiscuity and all the things that people are like, what is wrong with that person? Instead, we should be asking, what happened to them or to me? And being able to identify that part of those things, and I'm not talking about blaming your past for your whole life. That's not what I'm saying. But when you can look at what happened to you and you can deal with it, and on purpose step onto a healing path to actually manage and kind of create your own story into a hero story, a story of surviving and then becoming the hero in your own life. You are your hero. You survived this thing. So if you can become that in a way that allows you to move forward in a happier, healthier way, that is the goal. It's not like one thing is going to get you there, or that it's, do this positive thinking meditation once a day for 100 days and you will be cured. But if you do something 100 times, something will shift. Mm-hmm. If you do it 1,000 times, something will really shift. Mm-hmm. If you do it 10,000 times, you're a concert pianist. And that's really how you have to think about healing. It is like that. People think it's a desire. It's not a desire. It's a doing.
Yeah. And it's not an event. It's an experience. It
That's
doesn't
right.
just happen. It takes lots of what you're just saying, the repetition of doing that work more and more and more. And it does. It actually resolves a lot of what we're talking about, so that some past patterns of those activators become less frequent and some of them completely go away. And like you're just referring to and talking about, those healing processes actually manifest in the sense that, hey, I'm not having those stomach aches anymore. Hey, I'm not having those headaches anymore.
Yeah.
And our life changes and things get better and our worldview changes.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and it's also like it's our behaviors change too. The way we were behaving before is like different than how we're behaving now. And our reactions to things are different. And I'm about to go into another practice. One of our online community members who has developed a program, it's called Joan of Heart. And her partner died, and her name was Joan. And it came to her one day, and survivors, again, of abuse. She said, I have to do this program. And it's all about really quieting the reactive mind and being able to like be an observer. And she uses a lot of Eckhart Tolle, his works like The Power of Now and some of his books. And she says, if you can become the observer, and I read this in a book, I just realized it was the book Fierce Joy by Susie Reinhardt. And she writes in there when she was looking at all of her thoughts that were fear-based, her fear-based thoughts, because she found out she had a tumor around her brainstem. And it was choking her vocal cords, and she was literally going to lose her voice, like physically. And she was like, oh my gosh, do I have my own voice? Actually, all of a sudden appreciating having a voice, or am I just doing what everybody else has told me to do? And I'm this ultra marathon runner. And she said it was like I'm having all these thoughts about fear because it could kill me. Not only could this tumor kill me, but it could literally take my voice first and then still kill me. And she had 2 little kids, a 10 and a 12-year-old. And she said, and I'm just sitting there with my thoughts. My family went camping after we found out about this, and I told my husband I need some time alone. And it was like I could see the thoughts I was having, these fear thoughts, and they were writing as fast as they could on this blackboard. And then she said, and then something even deeper inside of me, like my inner eye, my mind, not just my thoughts and emotions, but my mind was then reading the thoughts on the blackboard. And as I thought, well, let's say I only have 5 months to live. Is that how I want my last 5 months to be run, by that thought of fear? And she said it was so interesting how all of a sudden it was like my mind was erasing that thought from the blackboard and replacing it with fierce joy, brave over perfect, like these other concepts that her inner mind was replacing her thoughts with. And then she said it became a practice. And I thought, ooh, I want to be that. I want to figure out my reactive mind and then have that deeper inner eye come in and go, okay, so I'm going to do this program with my friend, Nikki.
It sounds awesome.
Right? I'm still healing. I'm interested in all these things.
It's exactly
still,
right.
Even though I'm an old person now, apparently. I can get the senior discount like at Denny's and everything. It's weird.
That makes me really old, then, because I'm older than you.
Drives me crazy. I'm like, do I look like I deserve the senior discount? Stop. No, it's funny.
And it is funny. And I'm glad we have things
thing
to laugh about.
Right?
Because that also shows a sense of healing when you can get to the point in your life where you can laugh about things again.
Absolutely.
And feel things in a different and better way.
Yeah.
You know,
and that even is a practice.
Yes.
Watch a cat video every day that makes you laugh. And if you do it enough times, when you get to 10,000 repetitions of watching something funny every day or twice a day, you literally will see humor in the world that you didn't see before. It's an actual, that's a great example of something you can do to change your negative brain.
It's a real thing.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
It is. And I love that because I love to do things. I'm a doer, do. I'm an energizer bunny.
I know you are. I've watched. I've experienced that exact thing with you. Jan, thank you for all of this. It has been so enlightening and so uplifting and helpful. I just know that, like I said earlier, people are going to benefit from listening to this episode. Thank you for coming back.
Oh, Dave, it's such a pleasure. Seriously, I love it when you co-host with me on my podcast. It's just a wonderful mutual respect and love.
It's medicine for me, too.
Yeah.
I enjoy it. I am going to do what I always do with each one of my guests when I get to the closing of the interview, and that is ask you, what are you going to do? And what do you do for self-care after these activators have come up? Because we've talked about some traumatic things, and I've just witnessed those emotions and responses come up to the surface with you. And this discussion even will have an impact and produce activators that make more things come to mind that maybe were implicit memories. You didn't know they were there. And over the next few hours and days and couple of weeks, this will have an impact. What are you going to do for the rest of the day that will get you through the day in a much happier and positive way?
Well, first thing that I do is I take these muscles in my face and I smile because that really does change your mood. It's a proven fact. It's scientific.
Yes.
So I'm going to actually spend some time with my wonderful executive director of our foundation. We're planning and organizing our 3 pillars, which are healing, awareness, and legislative change. And we just had a wonderful meeting earlier today where we're looking at what are the things that we could do and introduce and make into laws or policies throughout the country and throughout the world that could actually move the needle on, sexual violence against young people. And so having that meeting with some of the members of my community this morning, they had all these fantastic ideas. Everything from, like, shouldn't there be a number that a young person can call that's just theirs, like the 911 number or the suicide hotline? It's a 988, I think is that number. So we were talking about that and how do you make something like that happen and then have a campaign and make everybody aware of it so that a 4-year-old can pick up the phone and call this number. And that was one idea, but there were others that were amazing, like apps on a teenager's phone, that advertise, like, this is what grooming looks like, or whatever. We just had a wonderful, marvelous discussion earlier with several of they're kind of just community members who want to advocate and help. And they had a whole list of ideas, and that was really exciting. So we're going to talk a little bit more about some of those ideas and some of the things that we need to do to have in place to be organized so that we can do some of the fundraising that we need to have happen, so that we can create a summit that's going to happen like in a year. But I love making plans. So for me to sit and talk through, like, what is this organization? What is the Jan Broberg Foundation, Operation Chain Breakers, or breaking the chain of, child sexual violence, or however we're going to say it, one link at a time, because it is one person at a time. You break the chain of that being passed on by becoming yourself healed, aware, and advocating for others. That is the process. And then you can prevent it once people know that these stories are way too common and that they're everywhere. And it's not, it's not something over there. So we're going to spend some time just chatting and talking through how we're going to make some of these organizational ideas take effect. And what we'll do is we'll kind of look at the future and then work backwards. Like, okay, what do we have to do before, that passes in Congress? Or what do we have to do before that healing modality is funded and everyone that has been sexually assaulted gets to go and get this healing method, or whatever. And that, right, for me, really brings me into a place of just excitement, and it keeps me in a state of hope, because as we do these kinds of things, we know that there is hope for the world. And I need to stay in that space. I have a plaque right as you go out my back door, and it's right on the wall right there. And it says, "Believe there is good in the world." And I have to stay on that side of it, because I, like you, hear so many very sad stories, not only our own, but of other people. And I want to believe that we can initiate and continue to pass good forward, and that there are so many good people in the world who want to, join forces and help with this kind of prevention, so that we are out of business, Dave.
Yeah, that would be great, wouldn't it?
That would be really good. So I'm doing that, and I'm going to my sister's book club. My sister Susan is starting a book club in our online community tonight.
Nice.
And we're reading that book, What Happened to You. That's our book.
Tell people how they can become a member of your online community, Thrivivors.
Yeah, it's spelled like, if you want to thrive and you're a survivor with O-R, like as a person, it's spelled like that, Thrivivor, Thrivivors. And really, you can put that word into your Google Drive, and it'll bring up a way to go and join or at least explore our community. It can take you to the website that we have. So that website is, right now, it's just janbroberg.org. That'll take you there, just with my name, janbroberg.org, or .com will redirect you there. And you can get information about our podcast and the online community, the book, the series. Fantastic. And our foundation.
Yeah, and I'll make sure all of that is in the episode notes for this episode. And thank you. I'm going to invite you back. You are going to come back. I'm sure you'd be willing to. I don't even have to ask. I know that you're there, and I appreciate that. So We'll do this again in 6 or 8 months to kind of check into where you're at and where the foundation is and what's happening.
Good. We'll have had our first couple of fundraisers by then, so that'll be very exciting.
Cool.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Jan. Talk to you again soon. That does it for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. It was great to have Jan back in the studio with me, and I want to give her my deepest appreciation for her time and for sharing her story. I'm hoping that Jan's willingness to be honest and open with us provides new perspectives on some of the dynamics that you may be going through yourself, and that you gain some insights and ideas to help you on your own healing path. I want to give the invitation once more to those of you who've been raped or sexually assaulted and are ready to share your story with others in the pursuit of furthering your own healing and providing some guideposts in helping others heal. Just email me at davemarkel@gmail.com. That's DAVEMARKEL@gmail.com, and we'll talk about the possibility of you being on one of my episodes. I also want to express my gratitude to both my regular listeners as well as those of you who are hearing this podcast for the first time. The time you've spent with me here is greatly appreciated, and I hope you've been uplifted, inspired, and educated by Jan's interview. Please tell everyone you know about this episode and this podcast. And don't forget to rate this episode and subscribe to Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. Your rating and subscription help this podcast grow, and you'll be doing your part to help bring justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. Another way to help do this is to start by believing, because we all know someone whose life has been affected by rape or sexual assault. We'll see you next week.